And one that I think we should probably start with because it is topical and timely is recruiting in the state of Florida. I'm obviously a Florida guy. Cooper, you're very familiar with the state as well, and fairly close to publishing my annual Sunshine State scorecard, which is where I track how many kids from the state of Florida are staying in Florida among the 4 and 5 stars. And recently, the returns have not been great, and Georgia and Bama and Clemson and Ohio State and occasionally LSU have been the beneficiary of those top teams in Florida failing to keep those kids in the state. And I don't think there's any doubt that one of the reasons Dan Mullen is out is because despite the fact that he had a really nice first 3 years in Gainesville, this year on the field wasn't great. If that's all it was, I think they probably look at the bigger sample set and say, hey, pretty good first couple years. But when they turn the page and they look at the recruiting and they kind of take a look under the hood at what was going on in that program, not a whole lot of belief that he was going to be the guy to get that thing turned around there, despite his on-field acumen.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, you look back at it, I was looking at Florida and what Dan Mullen has done since he has been there. The recruiting in terms of what the expectation is. You go back last year, they're number 12, 9 before that, 14 in 2018, number 11 in 2017. Like, those numbers aren't bad. I think it's what the expectation is and who you're being constantly compared to. And in the East, you're being compared to that machine that Kirby Smart has built to rival Alabama and Nick Saban. So that's tough company at Florida with Dan Mullen. That being said, that's the expectation at Florida. There's no reason that the University of Florida shouldn't be in the top 5 every year, or at least right outside the top 5, looking into that conversation. So in terms of Mullen and what he did on the field, I think he is one of the most respected X's and O's coaches in the country. And I think Dan Mullen is a good football coach. But there's a difference between being a good X's and O's coach and being a CEO of a program, especially at a place like Florida, understanding the amount of detail and nuances that go into recruiting and overseeing that side of thing. And then I think more that did him instead of what happened on the field was more of the disconnect in terms of the messaging in recruiting. And I think there was a lack of awareness, especially when it came to understanding where they really stood in the pecking order behind Alabama and Georgia in the East. I think that really kind of did him in more than anything. And then there was a lot of negative attention really the last month before he got let go.
I completely agree with you on that. It is important to understand where you stand with your targets. This is something that I criticized Willie Taggart for when he was in Tallahassee. And I straight up told that staff when they asked me, you guys aren't getting Evan Neal. You need to get off that and get to a plan B or a plan C, because if you stay on your plan A too long, your plan B and plan C are going to commit elsewhere. And you're going to end up with a plan D or plan F, a guy that really probably can't play in Tallahassee. Certainly that plagued Florida at times as well. The other thing that really hurt them, to do a little postmortem on it, is, okay, we didn't notice at the time, but with the benefit of hindsight, the first class you sign as a new coach in the early signing period era, that class you only have 2 to 3 weeks to put together at best in some circumstances. We know now that the overwhelming odds are it is not going to work out for that class. A lot of the higher rated kids in those classes have tended to be kids who maybe were available for a reason. And I don't mean a good reason, right? I mean a bad reason. Maybe competitive temperament, mental health issues, disastrous family that the staff doesn't want to deal with all the issues that comes with that, injury history, maybe some grade stuff that, are not able to be discovered by some of the rating services, which means you need to knock your next class out of the park. That first full class that you sign is absolutely vital. It always has been, but I think that import is magnified now because of the likelihood of that first class you sign is not going to give you very much. And indeed, Dan Mullen's first class he signed that he only had a couple weeks to put together, really through no fault of his own, because we're seeing even guys that are really successful right now, like Jimbo at A&M, his 2018 class is just as bad as Dan's was. Like, you just don't have time to put it together. You have to knock that next class out of the park. And that year, I thought they did a poor job overall. They actually took some kids kind of late in the process that I felt like they were taking to appease the boosters when you go on the rubber chicken circuit and do all those dinners in the off season to kind of pump up their class rating, guys that other staffs knew would not qualify, right? I mean, other staffs in the state knew Diaby Hammond was not going to get in, and they backed off the kid. Florida took him. Why? He was a 4-star player, on talent. Grades, obviously, academics prevented him from getting in. DeJuan Black, obviously he's there now, but they took him. Obviously, there was a little bit different circumstance. They never got Wilson into school. There were a couple other guys that had pretty major red flag, character or competitive temperament issues in that class who they took, who washed out after like a semester. And the evaluations of other staffs were validated there, obviously. So if you stack back-to-back kind of iffy classes, you're going to have problems once McElwain's players get off that roster. And I thought some of their recruiting recently had improved a little bit as far as their evals, but it goes back to your point. You're paid to fight Georgia, and Georgia is not slowing down. If anything, they're just kicking this thing into hyperdrive right now. Let's go ahead and look at you. I know you looked at the top 247 players in the state. I'll just go ahead and run down this list. This is pretty striking because the results recently have not been very good, but this is obviously a uniquely bad year because you have Mullen fired. We don't know the status of Manny Diaz. Florida State started 0-4. Amazingly, they might make a bowl, but they did lose all their recruiting momentum after starting 0-4 and losing, to FCS, Jacksonville State. So I want to focus mainly on the kids who are actually from Florida because we fold in IMG players into our ratings for the state of Florida. But my research shows that most of the time, the IMG kids who are from out of state, and particularly from out of region, are likely to return to their home region, typically. And so I don't think it's fair to set an expectation that Florida or Miami or Florida State are going to keep a lot of those IMG kids from, Jersey or California in the state. It happens sometimes, but it's not a real apples to apples comparison if you want to look at the historical trends and go back, even to the Urban Meyer days. So you had a pretty good stat to lay on me. What did you see for the top 247?
Yeah, I think what we saw with the top 20, not including the whole top 247, but the top 20 players in Florida. Okay, and this goes back, you pointed out this before we got on the call, was 7 of these guys, I believe, in the top 20 attend IMG Academy. But out of the 20, only 1 is committed to either Florida State, Miami, or Florida. And that's striking, So if you go at that list and you look at it, Shamar Stewart, uncommitted. Gabriel Brownlow Dindy committed to Oklahoma. Marvin Jones still hadn't made a decision yet. Jahad Campbell, Dalen Everett, some of those IMG Academy players from out of state, both committed to Clemson. And then you have Sam McCall, not till number 6, who is a very good player in his own right, committed to Florida State. And then the list goes on and so forth. Georgia, Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State. You continue to kind of see these powers living in the state of Florida. And there has to be some resistance there, resistance that Miami, Florida, and Florida State have not really given to these schools like Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and Clemson.
And if you're Florida, it has to be a huge feeling of a missed opportunity, right? I mean, Florida State's had the worst 5 years they've had in either of our lifetimes. Miami is continually down. When Urban Meyer was there, you got to recruit against kind of late career Bobby Bowden, and you got to recruit against, Larry Coker, and then I believe the transition into Randy Shannon. And even Ron Zook was beating them both in recruiting. Now, Zook didn't really do the coaching part as well as he needed to keep that job. But Urban Meyer comes in there, and he smokes those 2 teams in recruiting. Historically, when the other 2 programs in this state are down, somebody else takes advantage. And usually it's the third in-state team. What we've seen here, though, is that Florida failed to capitalize on that. And so it's been beneficiary of Georgia, Bama, Clemson, Ohio State, some of LSU, hell, even Penn State a little bit. If you look at some of the uncommitted kids in this state right now, like we said, Sam McCall is the one that stands out. He's already committed to Florida State. Shamar Stewart, 100% crystal ball to Texas A&M. None of the in-state schools, I think, have a real shot at him. Maybe Miami, but I kind of doubt it. Marvin Jones Jr. is an interesting one. no crystal balls in yet for him. We know that is what Bama, Florida State, A&M, Georgia. He didn't put Ohio State in his top 5, I believe. So you'll have a shot. His dad obviously played for the Knowles, and they have a good relationship with him, but you're fighting a battle there for sure. Mari Wilson, I expect to go to Georgia at this point. Earl Little is most likely Bama, assuming that they still have room. Now, Florida State thinks they're in second place there, if for some reason Bama fills, they could get that one. Nigel Kelly, not really sure. Oregon, FSU's in it. Clemson, Georgia, like there's a lot of potential ones there. I actually don't know what's going to happen with Thomas, the safety out of Niceville. Wesley Besaint is an in-state battle at this point. Most crystal balls on Miami. I actually put mine on Florida State following the visit. This is going to be a tremendous out-of-state haul. Julian Armella, who I believe our Bama site said probably not a take for the Tide. Florida and LSU are the other 2 finalists. They don't have coaches right now, so that's potentially problematic. If you're going to do some recruiting, I think we know where he'll go. Not really sure on the status of Dominic James. This is kind of bleak. I mean, Markeith Williams is still committed. He's a top 247 guy in the state of Florida to Miami. Florida still has Jamari Lyons, Chris Graves. But in a good year, these programs are pulling 6, 7, 8, 4, and 5 stars each out of the state, if not more. To have, what did you say, 7 combined? That's really problematic, and that's going to cause some roster issues. It's going to be tough to climb out of it in a short order.
Well, the other thing I think about, I was thinking about this the other day. I mean, it's such a parity issue. It starts in the state of Florida. I mean, look at the teams that are benefiting from this.
Yeah.
Alabama, Georgia, Clemson, and Ohio State. Arguably the most consistent 4 programs since the college football playoff era. And they're coming into a talent-rich state with very little resistance from Florida, Miami, and Florida State. And that's an issue for everybody else. And we talk about parity, but to me, in terms of roster construction, where it starts in the state of Florida. I mean, you look at Isaiah Bond, decommitted from Florida yesterday, Cristobal towards Alabama. The rich get richer. That's a top 100 player in the top 247 for Florida in their class. Shamar James, decommitted. Another guy, the corner, Humphrey from Texas, flipped to Georgia. UGA, Alabama, these really smart teams who continue to recruit throughout the entire process, they understand it. They understand that these teams are kind of wounded ducks and they're vulnerable right now. And it continues to strengthen their grip on the rest of college football. And they understand that. And they've certainly taken advantage of that. But in terms of the parity in college football and where these teams continue to get stronger, I think you look at Florida, and with those 3 teams down, much as like we were talking last week with Texas A&M, part of the reason that they're having a great class, not to take anything away from them, they're doing a fantastic job of taking away from Texas and LSU right now. And part of taking this next step as programs and continuing to build a winning, sustainable model is you have to take advantage when your opponents are down. And a lot of these teams, like we talked about in Florida, whether it's in Louisiana with LSU, the teams out there who find themselves in the mix year in and year out understand this and have done a great job capitalizing on it.
They really have. And if you look at a lot of the candidates that are being mentioned, Swamp 24/7, great job so far with all their VIP insider access stuff. Basically, to a man, everybody that Florida is looking at has a reputation as a very strong, organized recruiter. Billy Napier has a very strong recruiting reputation. Brian Kelly, I think, is occasionally hamstrung by the type of academic person or profile that you can not only get into Notre Dame, but that will profile to remain eligible at Notre Dame. It is higher than it is at some other schools. I think there are fewer majors you can hide kids in there with the Irish, but they do a really nice job recruiting nonetheless there in South Bend, in an area that doesn't have a lot of talent to recruit from in Indiana. They go national. They evaluate kids pretty well, and they certainly recruit to their brand. We'll see on the Lane Kiffin thing, but I think he has a reputation certainly as a really intense recruiter. They're going to have to turn this talent thing around. I don't think this roster is like one class away from being dominant. So it's going to have to be an organizational overhaul with the focus on roster building, and that's the key, man. I used to get a lot of flack for saying this when I created the blue chip ratio, but Mark D'Antonio, great coach. Gary Patterson, great coach, no doubt, no rings. Because who has rings? Gene Chiswick's got a ring. Mac Brown, known as like an amazing schemer? No, he's not. He's known as somebody who can hire coaches, run an organization with recruiting, and let the thing hum. College football, you have to have recruiting and coaching to win it all. But we do have examples where recruiting won it all, and the coach gets very little credit. Now, I think that's a little bit unfair, but I mean, Gene Chiswick won one with Cam Newton, right? And has not get a head coaching job since, and was fired, the year after? There are examples of dudes who are not thought of as good coaches winning national titles because of the talent. Find me an example of guys who are thought of as great coaches who win the national titles without great recruiting. I'm pretty sure we'll sit here all day.
Yeah, you got to find a blend. I mean, that's the thing. We always come back to it, like, right, my background certainly in recruiting, and I kind of feel like, I'm beating this drum, and it's one of those things I continue to say it, but I think that has to be apparent. That has to be at the forefront of every coaching search at one of these major programs, between USC, between LSU, between Florida, is, okay, if our expectation is to win a national championship and compete year in and year out for a playoff spot, then we need to have somebody who we feel very strongly and convicted about, not only as a coach, but as somebody in terms of how they're going to put a plan together to put us in that conversation in terms of one of the elite recruiting programs in the country. And this is a conversation that we're going to get into a little bit later in the show, but the demand for that is high. I'm not sure the supply is there. I mean, how many guys in the country can actually meet that standard? And like we talked about, I mean, Dan Mullen was a very good coach, in terms of look what he's accomplished at Florida. Understandably so. Florida kind of found themselves in a little bit of a conundrum this year where, like, what is the ceiling there? They obviously have a higher expectation for what should be achieved there. And in terms of the way Dan Mullen viewed recruiting, that just wasn't going to happen. Like, Florida in a nutshell to me was playing Alabama close. That was the ceiling at home earlier this year in Gainesville. And people saying, wow, I remember them coming off that game and saying, wow, the future in Gainesville is bright. That was the narrative. Yep. The next week they go on the road, I believe, and lose to Kentucky. Yeah. And that just goes to show the spectrum in terms of roster building.
Recruiting sets your floor and your ceiling.
Correct. And you're only as high as that ceiling and only as low as that floor. So I think that's one of those things. I get it. I understand it. I understand how that can kind of grow ad nauseum to fan bases who keep hearing that personnel should be at the forefront. But you get what you emphasize. And if you don't emphasize recruiting, at some point in time, that's going to show up.